Hello! So, for the last few weeks, I've been talking about how discipleship is like a beautiful vanilla bean. Last week, we discovered that because the vanilla blossom's chance of pollination runs at about 1% in the wild, they are hand pollinated for commercial production, which is a painstaking, time consuming process. For this last lesson in the series, I want to tell you about harvesting. Here in central Illinois, when we think of harvesting, we picture big combines and grain wagons. Vanilla bean harvesting looks nothing like that. In a 2011 United Nations video, they said that 80,000 farmers tend the vanilla beans, and it takes 260 days out of the year to cultivate 1 hectare of vines. By the way, that's less than 2.5 acres. So if they don't use combines to harvest vanilla, how do they do it? By hand. Once they are harvested, there is a very meticulous process for transforming this green bean into the flavorful brown bean we know and love. It starts with a quick but super hot bath. Their quick dip lasts for 3 to 4 minutes. Then just as quickly, it's drained and placed into a thick, dark layer of blankets. They are then moved to sweat boxes, and it's packed in more dark blankets to cool for 48 hours. After the initial 48 hours, they then begin an arduous drying process. The beans are taken out of their boxes and laid out onto dark blankets which absorb more heat in the sun. They will then sunbathe for 5 to 6 hours. The beans are checked periodically, and when they become too hot to touch comfortably, they are covered with the edges of the blanket and left to cool for another hour. The beans are arranged so that each bean's thickest end faces the center of the blanket, and then the blanket is rolled up with the beans inside. The blanket rolls are then placed back into airtight boxes lined with cloth and are covered with a lot more blankets to help them retain their heat over the next 24 hours. After the initial 24 hours, the beans should all be dark brown and they're just so lovely, but they aren't done. They remove the beans from the boxes and lay the beans out on the dark blankets for only 2 or 3 hours this time. Afterward, they are brought indoors at night to be laid flat or placed on racks to dry. This process is repeated for 5 or 6 days until the beans become pliant. At that point, they are allowed to dry in open ventilation for 30 days. The beans are smoothed and straightened by hand to help disperse the remaining oils within the bean. They are then wrapped in wax paper and placed into airtight boxes lined with wax paper. On average, it's 6 months from the initial harvest to world distribution. Now, I know that you guys are probably thinking, Jen, I know how you like to know the backstory of everything, but what does this have to do with discipleship? Well, hold on to your shorts, because here it is. Just like the vanilla bean, discipleship is handmade. It's pollinated by hand. It's harvested by hand. And it can't be mass-produced through machinery and technology. It's tended and watched. It's watched over through personal relationships that are built one moment at a time. It comes from being in community with one another. And I don't mean just by planting a booty in a pew. Acts 2:42-47 describes the fellowship of the believers. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day, they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. Think about how we utilize the vanilla bean. We split the bean down the middle and scrape out every fleck and morsel of the bean's interior. That's discipleship. Nothing is left. It's through our texts, emails, visits, events, tears, laughter, mourning, celebrations, Bible studies, service, and worship where discipleship is done, where we give all we have, all we are, down to our very individuality for God to use and transform for His glory. Deuteronomy 6:5-9 says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates." Teachable moments are born in the everyday moment of life, and it's connecting every day that allows us to utilize those moments for God's glory. Yes, you heard that right. Every day. It's personal, it's inconvenient, and it's messy. I've tried to imagine transforming my life into looking like the fellowship of believers in Acts. Can you imagine living in a community where our entire focus is the betterment of the community for God? Where we scrape out every bit of our own will, our individuality, to enrich and enhance one another in servitude to God's will? Jesus gave it all. He left nothing for himself. He left his rightful place with God to walk this earth, to live, breathe, and serve at God's will. He bled, he died, all so that we might be saved. It is through his selfless act, his willingness to follow God's will, not his own, that we have the grace of the gospel. But the gospel message doesn't stop at our salvation. We are to live the gospel message every day. Imagine if we lived like the believers in Acts. Imagine if we devoted ourselves to teaching, fellowship, meals, and prayer together every day. Imagine if we gave sacrificially to help those in need every day. Imagine if we actually worshiped together, ate together, not just because it was a thing to do, but because we were excited and joyful to praise God together every day. Imagine how different we would appear in the world. Discipleship is for the baby Christian all the way to the mature believer, because we are called to learn and grow through the challenge of being more and more like Christ together every day. In light of this definition of discipleship, our duty starts by asking the question, are we the church being genuine disciples of Christ?